From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's New York studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Biden set to react to the natural disaster of Hurricane Helene from the Oval Office later on in just a few moments, actually, after it ravaged southeastern states, prompting a massive recovery effort that we'll discuss with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Storm is impacting the presidential campaign, already buffeted by an impending dock workers strike on the East Coast. We'll have more from the trail this day before the vice presidential debate with political scientist Lara Brown.
And the Pentagon says an Israeli ground incursion into Lebanon appears imminent. We're joined on the latest in the Middle East by former Defense Secretary William Cohen. So from both Washington and New York today, welcome to Balance of Power. Of course, I'll be joining you in New York later on, Joe, as we await the VP debate taking place there tomorrow. But in the meantime, much more is expected this evening as both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, respectively, receive briefings on the Hurricane Helene aftermath.
Yeah, that's right. It's one of these things that could be difficult for a campaign to prepare for, never mind an administration, Kaylee. It almost feels like we're going into a new phase of this campaign with the natural disaster that we saw across the southeastern states, a couple of them considered swing states over the weekend, combined with the escalation in the Middle East. And of course, what could become a massive labor action tomorrow, this dock workers strike, all on the front page, but also in the political pages, Kaylee, impacting these campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Donald Trump in Georgia today, all of it setting the stage for the big event tomorrow between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, who will have to field questions, I'm sure, on all of these subjects.
Absolutely. And we'll have special coverage, of course, for you live from New York, the vice presidential debate tomorrow. And we have a long way to go between now and then. Let's deal with what we know now. And Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove reporting for Bloomberg at the White House. And the very latest, Josh, we understand President Biden is being briefed by FEMA, by his emergency management officials, and we'll have a statement at some point from the Oval Office. How's the administration dealing with this?
Yeah, and Vice President Harris is speaking now at FEMA as well, and so they both have sort of scrambled to illustrate the response today after getting some criticism from Republicans over the weekend. Right now, it looks like the response is basically focused on North Carolina. The storm, of course, touched roughly half a dozen states, but a bulk of the damage is in western North Carolina, and so that's what we're seeing. The FEMA director is stationed there. Biden has asked her to stay there until things stabilize, and right now it's a question of really sort of immediate response as opposed to rebuilding, so things like clearing debris, working on connectivity issues, including Starlink terminals that FEMA was already delivering, and then Donald Trump called Elon Musk about anyway. So a bit of, a moving pieces here as they try to set up a response and a little bit of political wrangling, even though, of course, Donald Trump's saying that this is not a time for politics, but both campaigns and the administration are bracing to sort of, reach out and participate in the response, or at least being seen to be participating to the response.
Yeah, the timing of this with this proximity to the election certainly can't be ignored. It's also because of the election coming up on November 5th that Congress currently is not in town. Yeah. They're all campaigning, and they aren't set to return until the vote is actually over. President Biden today suggested he may need to call them back for a special session to get supplemental funding through. When will we know if that's going to happen?
It's unclear right now. There is some support. Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, of course, has called for some measure of funding for it. We don't know what the price tag will be, and therefore, I think they'll wait on that to see. But it's just simply unclear as to whether House Republicans will come forward for it, whether there be enough votes in the Senate for it. It's anyone's guess, I think, right now. But the electoral footprint on this, and it's too soon to talk about that. Let me maybe first talk about right now, we had Liz Sherwood-Randall, the Deputy National Security Advisor. There are 600 people in North Carolina in particular unaccounted for. That often means sometimes they're without cell signal. It's not necessarily means that they've passed away, but the death toll and casualty toll is really up in the air right now, and I think they're focusing on that very closely right now. So we just don't know what the footprint will be. There are some reports, Associated Press, saying about 100 people have died in these storms.
Yeah, it's terrible, the humanitarian impact of this. Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove, thank you so much. And of course, if you're with us On Bloomberg television, you were just seeing there Vice President Harris giving remarks at FEMA here in Washington, D.C. So we're hearing from her. And earlier today, we also heard from Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp, who spoke about aid in his state following the devastation caused by Hurricane Helene. Take a listen.
Just know that we will work in a bipartisan way on disaster relief in this state with our federal, state, and local partners. We have submitted our expedited emergency declaration. This is something that's very rare, but this will help us, and I feel certain it'll be approved by the President and our federal partners.
For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief Julie Fine. And of course, while we heard from Georgia's governor today, Julie, we also heard from former President Trump, who made a visit to Valdosta.
Yes, he did. He did make that visit. And like my colleague Josh Wingrove said, yeah, it's not about politics. And the former president didn't talk too much about politics today. He brought truckloads of supplies. He talked about that. He did visit the devastation. However, he did say that Governor Kemp, and they have a tenuous relationship at best at this point, wasn't able to get through to President Biden. That is not true. The governor has said that he has been able to reach him. But overall, former president visiting the ravaged state, saying he would like to go to North Carolina at some time soon. Now, of course, there will be people that will be very happy that he came here, that he showed that he cared in the area. However, there are others that say, when somebody makes a visit like this is oftentimes why presidents take some time before they go somewhere like that, is that it does take resources to make sure that they can get there and get there safely. So there is that as well. But again, like Josh said, there will be politics playing into this.
Well, it's an important point that you make, Julie. The local officials have, of course, asked these national political figures to give it a minute here as they try to deal with the immediate devastation that the storm has left. We'll see if Joe Biden makes his way there sooner than later. I have to ask you about the Senate race that's going on in Texas. It's something, Julie, that you've been talking about before, since before people started paying attention. And we have another piece of polling out today, public policy polling, which shows this tied essentially within the margin of error, a statistical tie for Ted Cruz, Colin Allred. Are we serious that Democrats can flip this Texas seat blue?
Well, it's difficult for any Democrat in a statewide race to do this. However, what you are seeing is an extremely close race in a state where people are not afraid to spend money. So it is an uphill battle for a Democrat. But I will tell you, Colin Allred is running much differently than former El Paso Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who seemed to be everywhere. He really was a national phenomenon. He was a liberal darling. He's raised over $80 million for the seat. Colin Allred doing things much differently, raising his name recognition, but running a much more strategic campaign. So there is hope for Democrats here. The money rolling in now, the National Democrat Senatorial Committee they are putting money into this race as well. It'll be interesting to see. Yes, it is an uphill battle. Is it absolutely impossible? No, it is not.
It's quite a story that you have there. Julie Fine, Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief. We thank you, Julie, as always, for the reporting and the insights. Coming up, the U.S. expecting Israel to launch a limited ground invasion into Lebanon after its forces killed Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. We'll have much more ahead with the former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The United States will continue to work with our partners in the region and around the world to advance a diplomatic resolution that provides real security to Israel, to Lebanon, and allows citizens on both sides of the border to return to their homes. Diplomacy remains the best and only path to achieving greater stability in the Middle East.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken earlier today saying diplomacy is the way forward in the Middle East, even as the U.S. warns a potential Israeli ground incursion into Lebanon may be imminent. We're joined now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio by former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here with us on Balance of Power. Obviously, this potential incursion comes after Israel has now taken out Hassan Nasrallah and many other top levels of commanders of Hezbollah. If Israel goes in on the ground and that starts, how does this end? Does it end with the U.S. and Iran potentially being drawn more actively into this conflict?
Well, that's a real possibility. I think the Israelis at this particular point feel that they have Hezbollah on its heels, and they intend to press this certainly into Lebanon itself. The question will be how far and how long. Anytime you you invade another country, so to speak, or you create a buffer zone by establishing a presence in another country. The question is how long, and again, what's it going to cost you in terms of possible blood and treasure? As far as the United States is concerned, I think the Israelis feel that this is our war, and we're going to fight it the way we want to fight it. And I think that's okay as long as it's Israel's war. When it becomes somebody else's war, like the United States, then it's not quite okay. We have a say in this in terms of its potential spread to Iran. And if we should have to have American troops involved in that particular conflagration, I think at that time the calculation becomes, why did you not take the opportunity for a ceasefire and not try to solve it diplomatically? So right now I think the Israelis feel they have decapitated the leadership. They have interrupted communications. Iran right now is unsure of whether it wants to sacrifice Iranians as opposed to just sending Houthis or Hezbollah into the fight. We'll have to wait and see what the Iranians do at this point.
Mr. Secretary, it's always great to have you. I just want to mention quickly some breaking news from the White House. President Biden is speaking about the recovery effort following the hurricane and has just said to reporters that he will be visiting North Carolina this week. He'll be there on Wednesday, and he will do an aerial tour of Asheville, North Carolina. We'll let you know more as we learn it. Mr. Secretary, back to the matter at hand in the Middle East. I spoke earlier today with Natasha Hall from CSIS, the Middle East program senior fellow there. Here's what she had to say about this growing escalation in Lebanon, and to your point, what it would potentially cost in blood and treasure. Let's take a listen.
If Israel decides to actually mount an invasion into Lebanon, they will be mounting an invasion into a country that Hezbollah has had about 18 years to prepare for. So we're talking about tunnel networks. We're talking about still tens of thousands of troops. And frankly, Israel's actions in the past year have created a really limitless supply of soldiers, both in the region and beyond.
Mr. Secretary, this sounds like it could be much more formidable than Hamas in Gaza for the IDF. When we talk about the idea of a limited incursion, what would this actually look like, considering the teeth that these IDF forces would be walking into?
Well, as Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until I strike them in the face. And that's part of the issue here. The Israelis have a plan in terms of going in and trying to create a buffer zone so that 80,000 Israeli citizens can move back into their homes. The problem is that once you go into another country that is heavily armed, and that may be temporarily without leadership, without credible leadership, it may look good initially, but the longer you're there, the greater the chance that you will start losing soldiers and shed more blood by responding and killing more innocent people. And this is the issue, I think, that Don Rumsfeld raised years ago. Are we creating more terrorists than we're killing? And that will always be an issue if you kill a large number of innocent civilians. The families of those civilians will live for the day that they can retaliate at some point in time against you. So this is something that President Biden has been concerned about, saying, we support you, we're with you, but you have to take care that you don't create more terrorists than you're killing at this particular point. And we think diplomacy is a better solution here. Right now, I think the Israelis are saying, we're on our own for the moment. We don't need you right now. If it comes time to need you, we'll call you. And I don't think that's a positive place for the Israelis to be with the United States, since we are their biggest and strongest supporter. And you don't want to simply wave off the President of the United States saying, sorry, I can't take your call now, or I don't have any interest in listening to you.
Well, so what does that say, sir, about the power of U.S. diplomacy? Is this not getting mildly embarrassing for this administration that keeps saying publicly what it would like Israel to do and Israel not abiding by that?
Well, I think the Biden administration has said publicly what it would like Israel to do. Once again, no president is going to tell the Israelis how to fight a war in that region. That is for the Israelis to decide. But if they engage in conduct which involves others and potentially us and the American people, and should American soldiers start to die in the region because there was no attempt to reach a diplomatic solution, that changes the nature of our relationship going forward. So I don't think that's in Israel's interest. It's certainly not in ours. And I would hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom I have known for more than 40 years, that he is not interested, frankly, in arriving at any kind of a peaceful solution as far as the Palestinians are concerned. He does not want a separate state for the Palestinians, and I believe there will never be security for the Israelis unless the Palestinians have a state. So we're at that particular point where he feels he has to respond to the ultra-conservative wing of his party to stay in power, and that is what they want to do, is to basically clear out the Palestinians from Israel itself, or Palestine, and never have a two-state solution. That's where we are at this particular point. Whether that proves to be in the long run for the Israelis, I don't think so. I think the long run for the Israelis is to have a relationship with the Saudis, the UAE, the Bahrainis, and the other Gulf states. That will bring real security, as opposed to just going into Lebanon at this particular point and then telling the Iranians, try us, see if we respond, and we will respond in a way that you won't like. So I've always believed that you need a big stick, but you also need the stick of diplomacy, and I think you need both right now. The Israelis have demonstrated that they're prepared to wage war. They have to be interested in saying we're prepared to also wage diplomacy here with the help and support of the United States, NATO countries, and all others who are concerned that this not spin out of control and affect the world economy.
It's good to have you back, sir. Former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. We thank you for the time, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, we look ahead to tomorrow night's vice presidential debate. Political scientist Lara Brown joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Tomorrow night, Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz are set to debate. The vice presidential matchup in New York set for 9 p.m. Eastern on CBS and will be simulcast here on Bloomberg. So for a preview this evening, we're joined now by political scientist Lara Brown. Always great to have you on Balance of Power. Lara, could we just first discuss whether or not ultimately this debate matters? Are vice presidential nominees able to move the needle for their overall tickets in a forum like this?
Vice presidential debates have been relatively interesting. We typically don't hear much from these politicians, and so all of a sudden they are thrust onto the national stage and they get a spotlight that they haven't typically had. They don't usually make more than kind of, if you will, first impressions to the voters. But what they do is give really most voters more of a sense about what the presidential candidates are looking for in terms of staffing up their administration. Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that's unique about this time, at least recently, is that there are no other presidential debates in the month of October, which typically there are. And so with that, this is likely to hold more importance than those other debates in the past.
Well, to the extent, Lara, that it's the running mate's job to amplify the message of the candidate at the top of the ticket, in this case, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, I wonder what you expect tomorrow night after what we heard from Donald Trump over the weekend, talking about Kamala Harris and her mental acuity, if I can put it lightly. Let's take a listen.
Crooked Joe Biden became mentally impaired, sad. But lying Kamala Harris, honestly, I believe she was born that way. There's something wrong with Kamala. And I just don't know what it is, but there is definitely something missing. And you know what? Everybody knows it.
He said in a separate speech in a swing state, Lara, that Kamala Harris is mentally impaired and mentally disabled. Considering the weight that that carries in our society today, I wonder what you think of this sort of rebranding or reframing of the candidate, if we can call it that, from the Trump camp, and what we're going to hear from J.D. Vance on that score tomorrow.
Well, I think three things about it. First of all, if she was, so deficient in her mental abilities, then I doubt she would have been able to best him as soundly as she did in the debate that they have. Secondly, this really has a sense of both racism and sexism underneath it, because what he's suggesting is that somehow, Joe Biden, the president, a white man, sort of became mentally impaired over time. He just lost his edge. But when he's talking about Vice President Harris being born that way, really what he is saying is that a woman, a person of color, obviously they are born in some deficient manner. Now, I think the third thing I think about this is that typically presidential candidates leave it up to their vice presidents to do the attacks. In this instance, certainly former President Trump did not, and I think that it will actually redound negatively on him and his candidacy. Part of why most candidates leave it up to their vice presidential candidates is they'd rather sort of be the good cop to their vice presidential nominee's bad cop. But former President Trump has no problem with what he's putting out there.
In our final minute here, Lara, it's also worth noting the rules of this debate, because they're different than the presidential debate we saw just a few weeks ago. No fact-checking from the moderators, we're told, and the mics will be hot for all 90 minutes. Are the American people served by these rules?
Well, I do think that we are going to see a fairly disciplined debate. So the mics being live are not going to be as much of an issue as they had been in the past with former President Trump's kind of impulsive interruptions. But I do think we're going to also see, I think really it will be disciplined, but it could be fierce and it could be pretty tough, because both men are going to be claiming they are the heart of the Midwest. They know this country and its people, kind of its salt of the earth, better than the other one.
Yeah, and they both have bosses to impress. Lara, we'll be watching along with you. Lara Brown, great to have you back on Bloomberg. Thank you for the insights. Coming up, our conversation with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. It's next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
As you know, our country is in the final weeks of a hard-fought national election. But in a time like this, when a crisis hits, when our fellow citizens cry out in need, none of that matters. We're not talking about politics now. We have to all get together and get this solved. We need a lot of help. They have to have a lot of help down here. We look out for one another. We pull together. We pitch in. We persevere, and we pull it through.
Donald Trump speaking earlier today about the damage caused by Hurricane Helene. As we assemble our political panel, there are major political implications of this natural disaster. Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, both with us here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Nice to see you in New York. Jeannie, Donald Trump says Joe Biden was sleeping on the beach all weekend, not dealing with the matter at hand. We just learned from Joe Biden he's going to be flying to North Carolina on Wednesday. How is he doing with this?
You know, I think so far so good. But to Donald Trump's point, there are always potential political implications for these storms. We saw that in Superstorm Sandy. We saw that in Katrina. So the administration has to get on top of things. But I think one thing that we all have to keep in mind is it was Donald Trump a week ago who was talking about shutting down the government for a bill that didn't need to be passed about voting, which is illegal for immigrants or non-citizens, I should say. And it is also Donald Trump, while he has disassociated himself from Project 2025, that is a plan that says that maybe the government shouldn't assist in rebuilding homes and businesses after these kinds of catastrophes. So, you know, I think, is the Biden administration doing okay? So far, so good. It's still early. But let's hear what Donald Trump would plan to do on all of these things, because it has enormous implications for us. I didn't even get to climate change yet, but I will stop there.
That is part of the story.
We'll let you get there in a moment, Jeannie, but I do want to hit Rick on this, too, because Donald Trump went to Georgia today. He was there on the ground in an affected community. We have yet to see Kamala Harris do the same, keeping in mind Georgia is a swing state, as is North Carolina. She should be spending time in these places anyway right now.
That's correct. We have two states critical to her election as president that have been devastated by this superstorm. And the reality is she's out west raising money in Nevada.
She's now here in D.C. meeting with FEMA.
She's here now. But, why not fly directly to one of the affected areas? Instead, she flies to Washington and meets with FEMA. A very government response. In fact, it sounds like she's got her vice presidential hat on and not her candidate for president hat. If she had her candidate for president hat on, she'd be in North Carolina today.
So with that said, he's going to be flying over Asheville. Does Kamala Harris also make a trip south?
I think she does, as long as it doesn't interrupt the rescue efforts. That's very important. You're going to be talking to Pete Buttigieg. The administration is on top of these things. So, you know, I think number one is you don't want to interrupt. But I do agree with Rick on this. I'm not sure a 5 o'clock meeting at FEMA is exactly the kind of presentation you want to make. Though we need to, appreciate the work that FEMA is doing, certainly, and everybody who's working for the federal government on this. But it is really with the victims where you want to be. So I think the visuals on that weren't as strong as they could be. They may get stronger, but can I just say, this weekend, Donald Trump is talking about climate change as a hoax. He's talking about it as the biggest hoax that's ever been played on the American public. This is a result of climate change. So let's have that discussion. And I don't give Kamala Harris a pass on this. She's still supporting fracking, which we know plays into this. So we need a real discussion, and we need to hear from experts and scientists in the field who can tell us what is causing this tremendous death and destruction and help us do a better job, because the damage we're seeing from climate change is only going to get worse. And we need a real conversation on that in this country. And we just had a big event, a week in New York City on climate change. And this is what he is saying the day after.
Well, so that's what Donald Trump is saying. Let's listen to what Kamala Harris said at FEMA this evening, as we've mentioned it. Here were some of her remarks.
And over the past 24 hours, I have spoken with Governor Kemp of Georgia, Governor Cooper of North Carolina, and many local officials. I have shared with them that we will do everything in our power to help communities respond and recover. And I've shared with them that I plan to be on the ground as soon as possible, but as soon as possible without disrupting any emergency response operations, because that must be the highest priority in the first order of business.
She speaks, Rick, of doing everything that we can. And there's only so much, frankly, that can be done without money to do it. It raises the supplemental funding part of this equation. Congress is not currently here to address that. They're not scheduled to be back until after the election. Do you think they'll come back to have that vote?
I think if they want to get reelected, they should. Look, I mean, once they have an emergency declaration signed by the President of the United States, all the resources get turned on. They're not going to miss anything in those states because they ran out of money, because all that stuff is there ready to go today. It's the ongoing rebuilding process that really requires more additional capital, and that'll be the debate at the House of Representatives. Do we come back and do that, or do we wait until December when the continuing resolution is up and just fill the bucket then? I think this is the kind of moment the American public wants to see their members come back, lay down the political arms and do something for these states that are affected, and then go back and continue their political activity. But who knows what the House of Representatives thinks these days, and so I'm not making any bets on their responsiveness.
So why not call him back then? If Speaker Johnson doesn't, should Joe Biden be the one to say, Chuck Schumer, someone do something here, bring the members back and vote?
Yeah, if we need to, then they have to come back. And I do think they will. There is nothing more important. These representatives, for whatever we say about Congress, our members are very good at constituent service. They, their families, their constituents are suffering here. I have no question that they would come back and do their job if and when asked. And I have every faith that Speaker Johnson would call them back if needed. So, and that's absolutely what should happen.
Well, we'll, of course, let you know what does happen. And coming up, we're going to talk about the recovery effort from this storm with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, with us here live on Bloomberg. It's coming up next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us as we're joined now by the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, in the wake of the devastation that we've seen left by Hurricane Helene. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. There are a number of things we'd love to ask you about, beginning with this. People who are living in the most impacted areas right now feel like they're living on another planet. I spoke with a friend of mine in Asheville, North Carolina earlier today on an old-fashioned phone, by the way. Prema said, we have no water, no power, no Wi-Fi. We're bathing in the creek, boiling water to drink. There's supposed to be food and water tents, but we can't access info on where they're located. And she says the roads are filled with trees and power lines, so we can't get there anyway. We'd love for you to give us a real-time update, if you would, on what's happening on the ground here and when people like Prema will get some information on how they can help themselves.
Thanks. Yeah, the situation, especially in parts of North Carolina, but really across a number of states, is absolutely shocking. And of course, the best information for anyone directly impacted is going to come from local responders, local authorities. But what I can say from the transportation perspective on the federal side is that we have been engaged with the state leadership, with our folks on the ground, really from the early phases of this, to make sure that we can target resources to help restore that normalcy. You mentioned a number of roads. We're finding reports of hundreds of roads that have been compromised, affected by landslides, mudslides, flooding, as well as a number of bridges that have either been compromised or need to be inspected. I-40, I-26, including in key parts of North Carolina and Tennessee, impacted. And it's going to be a while before that sense of normalcy returns. But crews are working very quickly to assess the damage and to clear away obstruction. We're able to provide funding to help make sure that that is never an obstacle to quick action, something that unfortunately is a tool we've had to use many times, most notably recently with the ship strike in Baltimore. But I've reached out to the governors of 6 impacted states, and our in-state personnel have been working to help make sure that those assessments take place. The first priority, of course, is safety, making sure that a bridge is in fact safe before it's cleared for traffic to travel on it, making sure that those roads aren't compromised as well. But first and foremost, our hearts go out to everybody who's been impacted. And President Biden has asked every part of this administration to be there for as long as it takes, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Well, how long, Mr. Secretary, do you expect it will take? You mentioned it could be quite a while until there's a return to normalcy in these areas when it comes to actual transit infrastructure. What timeline do you think is realistic, and frankly, what cost?
Well, the timeline will be dictated by safety, and that's part of what the hundreds of inspections that are already getting underway are going to tell us. When is it a case of simply being able to certify that, for example, a rural bridge is good to go? When is it in a condition that means there's going to need to be a limit on the loads that can go on that bridge till it can be reinforced? When do you have a situation where a bridge may look okay, but actually it has been undermined by the floodwaters and has to be closed completely? We can't say in advance what those inspections are going to reveal safety-wise. But what we can say is we're going to make sure that the availability of federal dollars is not an obstacle to quick action. I expect the price tag will be enormous. This certainly in terms of a natural disaster outpaces anything so far mathematically that I've seen in terms of highway funding requests likely to come in. Now, we do have an emergency relief fund for this purpose. It will be able to respond to the immediate needs, but I don't see how we get the funding that's going to be needed overall without turning to Congress. I know even now there are bipartisan conversations beginning about how to put that request together.
Well, I'd like to ask you about that, Mr. Secretary. Among some of the other topics we'd like to get into, is it time to call lawmakers back? Do you think that that's something that we will see between now and the election? Otherwise, the people impacted by this storm could be waiting quite a long time.
Well, again, we do have billions of dollars available in the emergency relief fund. So just strictly speaking for the U.S. DOT, we're not looking at a run on the bank in the next few days or weeks. But we do face a bigger structural issue if Congress doesn't replenish that fund to be able to keep up with demands. Now, we have an authority called quick release. That means that we can get a very quick turn on some of these dollars. But at the end of the day, when you talk about the level of destruction that we are witnessing, that some communities are still assessing the level of damage. I just don't see how it's going to happen without a lot of concerted bipartisan action from across the country and from across the aisle.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why this timing is so difficult, not only because Congress is not in session, but also because, sir, of something that could happen at a minute past midnight, just hours from now. 45,000 dock workers on ports along the East Coast and Gulf are set to go on strike unless some last-minute agreement can be reached. These are ports that handle imports of goods that may be needed in some of these areas affected by Hurricane Helene. Is that factoring into the conversations at all from your understanding? And frankly, what can be done to secure those supply chains if this strike does indeed happen?
It's certainly something that adds to what is already the major importance of America's ports, and it's why we have been engaging the parties really for months, as it's been known that this deadline was approaching, because it will take the parties coming to terms. That means the ocean carriers and the ports and the dock workers, in order to prevent a strike like that. Now, if you think about the timelines of ocean shipping, obviously they're very different from the timelines associated with something like air freight, and the stocks that you expect to see aren't a kind of a day-by-day thing. But it doesn't take long before you would really feel the impacts of that. Now, we've established tools here at the Department of Transportation to help manage some of the very different supply chain issues that we've seen, starting with COVID, then what happened on the Red Sea, issues with water levels in the Mississippi River and the Panama Canal, and now the potential for labor action and the impact that would have. It means we've got a dialogue with a number of logistics and shipping players who weren't all talking to us or to each other before we built up some of these relationships and some of these tools as a department. Just today had another convening that my colleagues at DOT brought together with about 60 different players across logistics and supply chains to make sure that we're mapping everything and anything that needs to happen in terms of adjustments or flexibilities across road, rail, and different ports across the United States. But certainly the best thing that could happen is for the parties to quickly come to terms, to do that before midnight and for there to be no work stoppage.
Well, yeah, we're talking about basically half the imports coming into the United States that these East Coast and Gulf Coast ports are receiving. Mr. Secretary, this really speaks to the focus of your job right now. Could you be more specific about the contingency plans that you're making to avoid another snarling of our supply lines and avoid another inflationary experience that we all remember from our ports?
Well, again, we've been using tools that we've built up, a new multimodal freight office created by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, regular convenings, a new tool that we established called Flow, which helps to map the longer forecast for what's happening with ups and downs of container shipping, engaging with beneficial cargo owners, the shippers, the store chains and others that actually have the goods coming across on those containers, and understanding better the positioning that they've had. Now, there was some activity over the spring and the summer with the anticipation of the possibility of an issue on the East Coast, which led some cargo to be directed to the West Coast instead. But There's really no substitute for the ports being up and running. That's why the ports are where they are. And again, the most important thing is going to be for the carriers, the shippers, and the workers to come to terms so that everybody can be working and goods can move smoothly.
Well, Mr. Secretary, this is just one example of what seems to be broader labor strife in transportation. We've seen it in just the last few years with rail. We've seen it with cars. Now we're seeing it, obviously, at the ports. We're seeing it, too, with plane makers, as the strike is still ongoing of the Boeing machinist now entering its third week. What exactly do you see happening here thematically, and could it reshape American transportation moving forward?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a bigger, broader pattern in recent years. It's been characterized by these businesses in those sectors doing very well, a lot of profitability, certainly when you talk about shipping or when you talk about railroading, and workers insisting on participating in those earnings and frankly, having a president who supports the idea that these contracts should arrive on terms that are working for business, but also that are working for workers and allowing them a chance to participate in these sometimes record-breaking profits. That's what you saw, for example, recently with a historic deal that was reached with American Airlines and their flight attendants. We've seen a major raise going to rail workers, and also an issue that was not resolved at the time of the threats of a strike with rail workers a couple of years ago. At the time, only about 5% of them had access to sick leave. Right now, that's about 90%. And we were pushing for the railroad companies that can get that last 10% done to get together with their unions and make that happen. But there's no question that you see a period where workers are seeking to participate in the economic growth that's happening. You could obviously say the same in terms of the historic deal that was reached with auto workers. And look, when you have historic profits, and you look at ocean shipping, it became an unbelievably profitable industry over recent years. Then, of course, you're going to see workers seeking to participate in that to make sure that they're getting a share of that. The whole idea of collective bargaining is to reach an agreement on something that is consistent with the business thriving and empowers the workers to thrive. We've seen that happen time and time again as the result of collective bargaining, and it's what the president hopes and expects to see here as well.
Well, you must, Mr. Secretary, you must feel like you're running the Labor Department over the course of this conversation today. So I guess I'd have to ask you, ahead of tomorrow night's vice presidential debate, in our remaining moment, I know this is something that you've been involved in here. What is the message when it comes to labor that will win swing state votes?
Well, in this capacity, I can't speak about the campaign and election side of things. But what I will say is that you do have an administration that is proudly pro-worker. The president prides himself on being the most historically pro-labor president in modern times. And again, he's also demonstrated, given the record profitability and economic growth that we've seen, that being pro-worker can be consistent with business thriving too. Certainly, you're right, I've been involved in a lot of labor matters, but I don't want to take any credit from our acting Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, who has been doing an enormous amount of work, both in this particular case, engaging the different parties to help them make progress at the table when it comes to the dock workers, and more generally just doing a fantastic job helping to make sure that we have economic growth and worker empowerment at the same time.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time this evening on what I'm sure has been a busy several days. That's Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, live with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And now back with us in our final moments is our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. Of course, we just heard the secretary in his official capacity not able to comment on the vice presidential debate taking place tomorrow, but Rick and Jeannie can. Rick, I'll start with you. Is there greater downside risk than upside risk for J.D. Vance and Tim Walz tomorrow night?
I think that very little downside risk for Tim Walz. He has low expectations going into this debate. Very well done as far as managing that with the media. And I think with J.D. Vance, it's kind of an interesting thing. He's got a constituent of one, Donald Trump. But in the case, if Donald Trump fails to become president, then MAGA is up for grabs and he's in the slot for leadership. And so the question is, how much of this is a conversation with MAGA, or is it going to be focused on just doing what Donald Trump told me to do? And I think that's what I'm looking for, is to see where the distinction lies there.
What are you expecting from Tim Walz tomorrow night? He's going out of his way to lower the bar, telling people he's nervous. He doesn't want to let the boss down. He doesn't have quite as much experience, I'm guessing, at this as J.D. Vance. Has he set the bar sufficiently low?
I think he has. So, I think that's why everybody is looking at J.D. Vance. Here is a Yale-trained lawyer. He's proficient at, he is proficient at debating. He's very good on the stump. He's a great speaker. He's been taking questions from the press during his rallies. So I think the expectations for J.D. Vance are higher. What I'm expecting is what they always tell these vice presidential candidates. You're not debating the person across the room from you. You are debating the person at the top of the ticket. So I think we're going to hear a lot from Vance about Harris, and likewise a lot from Walz that hits Trump. I think one thing I would advise people to do is don't go back and look at the Cheney-Lieberman vice presidential debate in the next 24 hours. At least that's what I'm telling my students, because
you endured this.
It is, yes, but it's so depressing to see how far we have gone downhill when you talk about these debates. That was a very thoughtful, well-done debate, and I am not convinced we hear that level of serious policy debate tomorrow, but hopefully I'm wrong.
Well, if we're not going to hear that serious policy debate, Rick, are they going to be able to avoid questions about cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, or, frankly, for Tim Walz, stolen valor?
Yeah, I think that it's the responsibility of the moderators to clean up the record. They've said they're not going to fact check, but it doesn't mean they can't ask the questions. And so I suspect we're going to get a plethora of kind of personality-rated questions. What you said this at one point in time, now you're saying something different, that you've joined the ticket. And certainly their bios are up for grabs. So whatever they've said as presidential candidates or vice presidential candidates, certainly that's up for grabs, too.
Are we going to hear about stolen valor tomorrow night? Should Tim Walz be ready to defend his record?
Oh, he better be. That's one of the things that will definitely come up. I think he's going to be accused of being Gavin Newsom in a flannel shirt. That's another one we've heard. That's one of my favorites. I think, the reality for both of these guys is do no harm. They really can't make a mistake. That sticks with them. So that's where we are left, really.
It looks, Kaylee, like we have some news here on the port dispute that we've been talking about, the potential for a dock workers strike on the terminal. Port employers say they're seeking an extension of the current master contract, exchanging counteroffers. Kaylee, this story may not be over tonight.
Yeah, they say their offer would raise wages by nearly 50%. The union is looking for 80%. So we'll, of course, have more coverage of this and of the BP debate tomorrow right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.